My name is Carol, and I'm talking about using clinical science. Fun fact, I'm a clinical psychologist, kind of random, I know, to tackle this lovely thing called code review anxiety. I'm actually going to lower this a little bit. Okay, all right, so I want to start with a little story first, okay? So 2 years ago, I was a psychology professor. So the thing about being a psych professor is that you still conduct research, you still conduct analyses, and you still write code. What you don't do is use this lovely thing called GitHub. So 2 years ago, I started as a scientist in the Dev Success Lab at Pluralsight, and my manager was like, you gotta get ramped up on GitHub. And I was like, okay, fine. So I open up the GitHub, and I see that there's this thing called a repo, and it says Dev Success Lab on it, so I click on it. There's a place to put your code in, and I'm like, code goes in here. I'm so smart. So then I copy my entire data analysis workbook at the time, which is like 1,000 lines of code, and I just like paste it right in and press commit. And I'm like, did the GitHub, wonderful. And then I go back to my data analysis workbook and I like make some changes, like make some edits, add some things, delete some things as one does. And I have this like beautifully brilliant moment where I'm like, you have to update the repo, Carol, duh. So I go ahead and copy the entire workbook again and paste it into the GitHub and press commit. And I am pretty stoked right now. Like, I'm so proud of myself. I'm like, I didn't just do GitHub once, I did it 2 times. Like, I'm pretty sure I'm crushing it, right? I'm so proud of myself that I don't just tell my team about this, I also tag the entire channel for some reason, so that like everybody is like forced to celebrate with me like a totally normal person. And I'm like, this doesn't require review, because I probably did it right. But I just want to publicly say that we have code in GitHub. Feeling really pumped and proud of myself for diving into GitHub, TBD if I actually did it right. And then I have this like celebrating emoji because I'm so excited. My teammates, who are very kind and haven't seen what I've done yet, like also react very positively. My manager, you see here, also hasn't seen what I've done yet and says phenomenal with multiple exclamation marks. Sweet baby angel, you know, she's in for a ride. Some things I really love about this. First, I love that I say it doesn't require review unless you really want to. Like, there's a little bit of unearned confidence here. And then I also say TBD if I actually did it right, because there is this piece of me that is like, that was kind of weird. Like, how are they going to know what is new, right? Like, do they just read lines and lines all day? This is crazy. And of course, I did not do it right. So my manager sends me some really kind feedback, and even though the feedback is really kind, I have my first experience with code review anxiety, okay? And because of that anxiety, I have this thought, that was a really stupid mistake. I should have known better. She regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent. By the way, I have no idea when this picture was taken or where. I'm just like very distressed about these French fries for some reason. And that's okay, we all have those moments, right? So what is code review anxiety? You can think about this as any fear of judgment, criticism, and negative evaluation when giving or receiving code reviews. So kind of put very, very simply, it's any anxiety you experience about a code review, okay? So the thing about code review anxiety is that it's actually quite common. And in fact, anybody can experience this. So in my research sample, we saw that folks had anywhere between 1 to 65 years of coding experience, okay? So this isn't like an experience issue. Anybody can have this. Just to kind of highlight this, raise your hand if you've ever felt anxious about giving or receiving a code review. Yeah, like it happens, okay? All right. Now I want you to raise your hand if you've ever actually talked about that anxiety with your teammates. Okay, so a lot less of us, right? And that makes a lot of sense because we don't typically talk about our anxious experiences in the workplace. This is actually kind of a problem, though, because when we don't talk about our experiences like code review anxiety, it makes those experiences really invisible. And when our experiences are invisible, we tend to feel really alone in them, even though we're not, right? Like, we all raised our hands here. We're not actually alone in this experience. And so very quickly, like, the whole ethos of this project became about really showing people, hey, listen, Like, you are not alone in your code review anxiety, right? You're not crazy, you're not weird, you're not unskilled for having it, because in fact, code review anxiety is quite normal. I also really, more importantly, wanted to show people that there's something that you can actually do about that anxiety. Because just because something is normal doesn't mean that it can't still be a blocker, right? It can still get in the way of our lives, our well-being, career progression, et cetera, et cetera. And that makes a lot of sense. As an anxiety scientist, I can tell you, one of the primary outcomes of anxiety is actually avoidance. So in the context of code review anxiety, that means folks will procrastinate on code reviews. A lot of folks just kind of avoid doing them completely, or they'll disengage from them, right? Like rubber stamping, skimming, et cetera. The thing about avoidance is that it is a really great method in the short term. You're anxious about something, you get rid of the thing, now your anxiety's gone, and you're like, wonderful, right? But it also has a lot of long-term consequences. So for example, it actually makes your anxiety a lot worse in the long term. And then it also prevents you from accessing any documented benefits of things like code reviews. So things like improved code quality, code security, learning and knowledge transfer, collaborative and creative problem solving, trust and community building, right? All of these lovely things. So kind of like in a nutshell, if we want to benefit from things like code reviews, we actually have to find a way to mitigate that code review anxiety first, okay? So how do we mitigate that code review anxiety in a science-driven way? And I want to really double down on this science-driven way piece here, because if you go onto the interwebs, as one does, there's a lot of opinions about how to reduce anxiety. And the problem with these opinions on reducing code review anxiety in particular is that they don't work, and they actually make your anxiety a lot worse. And these are very well-intentioned, so if you do these things, no ding on you, I get it. So the first thing that folks will do is that they'll kind of dismiss code review anxiety as something you grow out of as you get more experienced. So you might hear things like, oh, it's an experience thing, don't worry, you'll get used to it, you'll kind of grow out of it. So this is a problem because, like we just mentioned, anybody can have code review anxiety, right? It's not actually an experience thing. Not to mention, even if you did kind of magically grow out of this thing, you kind of want to give support to people in the interim, right? You don't really want to say hey, things suck, they're gonna keep sucking for several years, oh well, right? That's not super helpful for folks. The second thing that you'll often see is that folks will focus on coding abilities instead of anxiety, probably because that's just a little bit more comfortable place for us to play in, right? So you might hear folks say things like, here's how to write better code, here's how to write cleaner code. If your code is really solid, there's nothing to feel anxious about. The problem with this actually is, you can, of course, feel very, very anxious about something that you did very, very well, right? They're not mutually exclusive. And so, I like to say that anxiety isn't merit-based. It's not something that you deserve. It's not something you earn your way out of. It's literally something that just kind of happens to all of us, right? Woo-woo, yay! So how do we do this in a science-driven way? So in the clinical sciences, the first step is to actually develop an empirical model. We do this because it helps identify what are the key mechanisms actually leading to that anxiety. Takes a targeted approach rather than a kitchen sink approach, we call it. You don't want to just throw things at it and be hope that worked, right? Want to be nice and efficient. So this is our model of code review anxiety generated using something called a path analysis. So here you see that when you experience code review anxiety and you're presented with this code review situation, okay, you have 3 cognitive biases that are triggered. The first is low anxiety self-efficacy. This is when you really feel like you can't handle or manage your anxiety. So you might say things like, oh man, I really don't know if I can do this, right? Or I can't really manage this, I can't handle this, don't really want to engage with this thing. Second is an elevated cost bias. This is when you overestimate the cost of something bad happening. So instead of saying ooh, I made a mistake, that kind of sucked, oh well, you're I made a mistake and it's the end of my career, right? You're really overestimating that cost. And then finally, you have an elevated probability bias. This is when you overestimate the likelihood of something bad happening. So instead of saying that may or may not break production. I mean, whatever, right? You're thinking, every time I make a mistake, I'm going to break production, and it's going to be terrible, right? So you see in our model that self-efficacy and cost bias actually directly increase that code review anxiety. And of these, self-efficacy is the stronger factor. So what that really means is, okay, at a minimum, our intervention needs to target the anxiety self-efficacy, okay? We also see that anxiety does lead to avoidance, unsurprisingly. And again, anxiety is the stronger factor leading to avoidance, really telling us, okay, if we want to reduce that avoidance, we really need to indeed mitigate this anxiety. So we have like our major mechanisms here, anxiety self-efficacy and code review anxiety. So the next step is obviously to actually create that intervention, right? So we want to do an evidence-based intervention. I chose to make this a single session cognitive behavioral workshop over Zoom. I chose this method because, first of all, cognitive behavioral workshops have been shown to have these really lovely outcomes like decreased anxiety, avoidance, and then increased self-efficacy are like major targets, right? And then also, I chose to make it a single session over Zoom because it's just more accessible, right? Many folks can kind of tune in from around the world, which they did. Folks don't have to travel, there's a lower time burden, et cetera, et cetera. So here is our intervention. Consistent with cognitive behavioral approaches, this had 4 major steps or parts. The first step is to actually teach folks how to assess their own anxiety. We do this first because it's just really, really hard to do something about your anxiety if you don't even know what's happening, right? That's actually true of most things. Like, you gotta know what's happening if you wanna do something about it. The second is to reduce any physiological arousal. We do this because it's just really hard to think or act rationally if you have intense physiological symptoms, okay? So if I am hyperventilating, I'm not thinking, gosh, how can I manage this code review in a rational manner, right? I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I need to breathe. Like, I just need to freaking breathe, right? Next, we teach folks how to challenge their biased thoughts. We do this because anxiety generally functions by making us think some pretty terrible things about ourselves and the world around us, right? When I'm really, really anxious, I'm not thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a coding goddess, I'm so great at this, I belong here, I'm like amazing, right? You're like thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a trash troll, what am I doing here? Get me out, right? Not great things about yourself. And then finally, we teach folks how to actually proactively engage with the code review to reduce that avoidance. Again, because avoidance does actually make your anxiety worse in the long term. I'm not gonna go over all of these things for the sake of time, but I am gonna go over challenging biased thoughts, because that is like the meat of this intervention. Okay. So the first step of challenging biased thoughts is to actually identify those thoughts, because again, you can't challenge a thought if you don't even know if you're having it, right? So we're gonna bring back sad, distressed Carol here, and she has this thought of she regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent, right? Just to give you a sense of like other folks' thoughts, these are real thoughts from real participants. One person said, you know, every time I see a code review, I think to myself, this is how I die. Not very helpful to think, obviously. Kind of more heartbreakingly, though, someone said, you know, I will never get the developer that reviews my code to respect or like me. Another person said, I'm always going to be the least smart and competent person on my team. And then actually a staff engineer said, I have too much experience to be freezed at this kind of task. I feel really ashamed. So you can imagine that if you're walking into a code review thinking, man, this team is never going to respect my work, right? You're not really setting yourself up for less anxiety. You're actually setting yourself up for so much more anxiety. Like, what an anxiety-provoking situation, right? Now the stakes are even higher. After you identify those thinking traps, you're going to go ahead and verify that it is, identify those biased thoughts. You're going to go ahead and verify that it is a biased thought by identifying thinking traps, And so you can think about a thinking trap as like a cognitive bias that happens when you're very, very anxious. Reductionist kind of definition, but it'll suffice for now. I'm not going to go over all of these, but I'm just going to go over the ones that we see in my thought here. So first, we definitely see some catastrophizing. I am predicting that something really bad is going to happen, even though I don't have any evidence for it, right? At no point did my manager say, hey, Carol, you know who's really incompetent? You. You know, like at no point was she like, man, I really, really regret hiring you, Carol, right? Like no evidence for this thought whatsoever. I also engage in dichotomous thinking. I'm only considering the extremes. I'm either like a superstar scientist or I'm completely incompetent, right? Also engage in some mind reading here. I have no idea what my manager's thinking. I cannot read her mind. And then finally, I engage in overgeneralizing. I take this like single mistake and I'm like, well, now I'm just incompetent, right? This single mistake here. We have verified that this is indeed a biased thought, so our next step is to actually challenge it. We don't really want to say like, there's a negatively biased thought, like, oh well, right? We want to like actually go ahead and challenge this thought. So we're gonna go with my typical thought here. She probably regrets hiring me because I'm so incompetent. And you can challenge this by asking yourself a series of guided questions. So you can ask yourself like, okay, Carol, am I 100% sure of this? And the answer is no, I'm not even like 20% sure of this. I might also ask myself, okay, am I placing unrealistic and unattainable standards on myself that I wouldn't expect another person to achieve? And the answer is yes. Yes, that was a really silly mistake, but I also wouldn't expect somebody who'd never seen or used GitHub before to like use it perfectly the first time, right? Like things happen. And then finally, I might ask myself, okay, does making a mistake really mean that I am incompetent, right? And the answer is no, like everyone makes mistakes. Superstar coders make mistakes. Superstar scientists make mistakes, right? That doesn't mean that we're incompetent, it just means that we're quite human. So from this, I would develop a rational response. This is just a more realistic and self-compassionate point of view. And so I might change my thought to, hey, everyone makes mistakes, Carol, it's just a part of learning, right? Like, that is a fact. So you might be thinking, okay, like, cool technique, lady, does it actually work, right? Like, that's kind of important. It does. I wouldn't be up here if it didn't. But just to kind of give you a sense of this, the next step is, of course, to actually test this intervention. And we do this empirically. I did this with 59 developers with code review anxiety, and I used something called a randomized controlled trial. This is a standard method for clinical trials, and I also use this because it helps make sure that any effects we see are actually because of the intervention. So things like anxiety, things like any cognitive or like emotional experience, they fluctuate over time, right? You're not at the same level of anxiety all day, every day. It just naturally changes. So an RCT helps you make sure, okay, this change is actually because of this workshop, not just because like things change over time, right? So here are our results. First result, it does decrease anxiety, yay! Developers felt less code review anxiety. And you can see here, comparing the two groups here, I think the white line shows up very well, I'm sorry. But the intervention group, if you look at the workshop graph, there's a larger decrease in anxiety scores compared to the control group where there's like not much decrease at all. We also see that our other target of anxiety self-efficacy was actually much higher in folks who had the intervention. So that lets us know, okay, when folks go through this intervention, they're better able to tolerate their anxiety, and they're better able to manage their anxiety, which is what we want, right? Again, you see here, the intervention group has like this massive increase in self-efficacy, whereas control group has like no change whatsoever. And then finally, as kind of like a fun bonus finding, our intervention also increased self-compassion. And so devs were were kinder towards themselves, and they were also much more validating towards themselves, which is awesome. Again, we see like a bigger increase in that workshop group in self-compassion scores, whereas there's like not much change at all in the control group, sorry. So how can you actually put this into practice, right? You're like, cool, love that for you, but it wasn't actually in the study, so like, how do I actually take advantage of this, right? As a first step, you can actually talk about code review anxiety on your teams. Like I said earlier, not talking about an experience makes that experience invisible, and when our experiences are invisible, we feel very alone in them, even though we are not, right? Again, I just think it's really important for folks to know that they're not alone in their anxiety, that they're not crazy, they're not weird, they're not unskilled for having anxiety. There's nothing wrong with them for that, right? Because code review anxiety is really freaking normal. And also, most importantly, that we can, in fact, do something about that anxiety. Just to kind of hammer this home a little bit, here are some quotes from former participants who posted publicly, or from folks who just read the science paper somehow and decided to talk about it on their teams. Someone said, "I left having never felt so seen. To be in a Zoom room with other developers who experienced similar levels of anxiety was truly priceless. Even after the session ended, a few other developers and myself stayed on with Carol for about 20 more minutes. The psych safety of that Zoom room felt special, and I wanted to absorb it for as long as possible." I should mention that this happened in multiple workshops where folks stayed longer, because it just feels so dang good to feel like, hey, this thing that I've been struggling with, I am not weird for having it, right? Here's an entire 30-person Zoom room of other people who experience this exact same thing. That feels really good and validating, right? It's really powerful for us to talk about it and normalize that anxiety. Another person said, "Knowing that code review anxiety is an almost universal experience has helped with some feelings of imposter syndrome. Acknowledging that it's a real thing, knowing other people, regardless of experience or skill, have similar thoughts and experiences, and having techniques to deal with it has been incredibly empowering and valuable." Again, knowing that something is normal, knowing that you're not crazy for having it, right? And then also knowing that there's something you can actually do about this anxiety that is really helpful for people. And then finally, somebody who was not in the study but kind of found the paper and then ended up reading it with their teammates said, "We ended up having a few people commenting along the lines of, 'I'm so glad to hear this isn't just a me problem,' right?" Really highlighting just talking about this code review anxiety can open up a lot of conversations and make your teammates feel really valued. If you are okay, well, I need a little bit more, which is totally fine. We actually created this code review anxiety workbook. This is a self-guided and self-paced workbook. It distills the actual intervention that we tested into this lovely workbook. You can go onto the webpage and work through it yourself there. You can download it, you can print it out, do whatever you want with it, work on it by yourself, with your teammates. This is yours to use, okay? So the TLDR of this whole thing. First of all, code review anxiety is normal. Know that it impacts developers across experience levels. It's not an experience thing, right? Code review anxiety can be a blocker. It leads to things like avoidance, procrastination, and it's maintained by things like low self-efficacy. And then finally, we can, in fact, do something about it. A single cognitive behavioral workshop can actually reduce code review anxiety, increase that anxiety self-efficacy, and then increase self-compassion. You can also follow this QR code for a copy of the science paper. It's also going to be published in Empirical Software Engineering soon. So yeah, if you like to read academic articles, find it there. Woo. Yay! Thanks. Sorry. And then just a final thank you to my teammates who were on this project, Kristen Foster-Marks and Kat Hicks, both of whom contributed. So just a shout out to them. And that's it. Thanks.